What if a single voice from your past could turn your world upside down? For 20 years, Alexander Ford, a self-made millionaire and one of the most influential executives in the Middle East, built his empire brick by brick, burying the pain of a love he thought was lost forever. But all it took was one voice, her voice, to shatter the walls he'd built around his heart. In this gripping story of love, redemption, and courage, you'll witness how Alexander risks everything he's worked for in a desperate attempt to rekindle the one thing he can't buy back, the love of his ex-wife. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to stay inspired by stories of transformation, courage, and second chances. Let's dive in. Alexander Ford sat in his opulent corner office, the Dubai skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city's golden hues reflected against his polished desk, a testament to the empire he had built through decades of tireless ambition. To anyone looking in, Alexander had it all: wealth, influence, and a name that commanded respect across industries. Yet, beneath the surface, his life felt like a hollow monument to a forgotten dream. That dream had a name: Layla. For 20 years, Alexander had locked away the memories of his ex-wife. Their love had been a firestorm, intense and all-consuming, but his relentless drive for success had snuffed it out. She had left, and he had let her go, convincing himself it was for the best. Until now. Alexander was on a routine video conference with an architect from Paris, discussing the finer points of a new luxury hotel. His assistant had set up the call, and it began like countless others, calm, methodical, and entirely professional. But then it happened. In the background of the architect's screen, a woman's voice rang out, clear yet distant. "Alex, can you grab the blueprint for the next segment?" He froze. His heart skipped a beat. That voice, he knew it better than his own. It couldn't be. But as the architect replied, the name confirmed his worst and most thrilling suspicion. "Layla, 1 second. I'll hand it to you." The pen in Alexander's hand slipped, clattering against his desk. The room seemed to close in around him. "Layla? Here? After all these years?" His mind raced, memories flooding back in a torrent. The laughter they'd shared on a Santorini beach, the late nights arguing about his workaholic tendencies, the way her hand felt in his. Soft, grounding, and gone too soon. "Mr. Ford?" The architect's voice broke through the haze. "Did you hear my question?" Alexander cleared his throat, his usual composure slipping. "Yes. Apologies. Let's continue this discussion later. Something urgent has come up." He ended the call abruptly, his hand trembling as he removed his glasses and placed them on the desk. His pulse thundered in his ears. What were the odds? What was she doing there in Paris, working with this man? Questions swirled in his mind, each one louder than the last. Standing abruptly, Alexander crossed the room to the window. He stared out at the glittering city below, the view that once filled him with pride, now feeling insignificant. The life he had meticulously crafted no longer seemed enough. He had to know. He had to see her. With a sharp breath, Alexander grabbed his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel all meetings for the next 2 weeks," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "2 weeks, sir? May I ask—" "Book a flight to Paris," he interrupted. "I need to leave tonight." There was a pause on the other end. "Understood, Mr. Ford. I'll take care of it." As the call ended, Alexander sat back down, his gaze drifting to an old photo tucked into the corner of his desk drawer. It was them, on their honeymoon, carefree and impossibly young. Her smile in the photo burned into his mind as he whispered to himself, "I won't let this slip away again." For the first time in decades, Alexander felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't just longing, it was hope. He didn't know what awaited him in Paris, but one thing was certain. He would face it head-on. The private jet hummed quietly as Alexander stared out the window, the endless expanse of sky reflecting the whirlwind in his mind. The usual luxury surrounding him, the plush leather seats, the fine crystal glass of whiskey in his hand, felt hollow against the enormity of what he was about to do. Paris wasn't just another destination this time. It was a gamble with his past, one that could either reignite a long-lost love or confirm that he had waited too long. As the plane descended, Alexander's chest tightened. The city of light unfolded beneath him, its iconic landmarks glittering against the evening sky. Paris had always been her dream, he remembered. Layla had spoken of it with such passion, sketching out plans for weekends in Montmartre and evenings by the Seine. Back then, he had been too consumed with work to take her seriously. Now, he was about to chase her into the very life he had denied her. By the time he reached his hotel, a 5-star suite overlooking the Eiffel Tower, Alexander's usual confidence was beginning to crack. He had no idea where to start. How do you find someone in a city of millions when all you have is the sound of their voice and a name spoken in passing? He picked up his phone and dialed the only number he could think of, the architect from the video call. The man answered on the third ring, sounding surprised. "Mr. Ford, this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" "Yes, thank you. Apologies for the abrupt end to our last meeting," Alexander began, his tone measured. "I'm in Paris on business and thought I might take the opportunity to follow up in person." "Of course. I'd be happy to arrange a meeting. When works best for you?" "Tomorrow morning," Alexander said, keeping his voice steady. "At your office." As he ended the call, a wave of relief swept over him. This meeting wasn't just about business. It was his only lead. Layla was there, working alongside this man. He would see her again, even if it was only for a fleeting moment. The next morning, Alexander stood outside the sleek glass building that housed the architect's firm. His heart raced as he stepped through the doors, greeted by the cool air and polished marble floors. The receptionist smiled politely and guided him to a private meeting room. The architect, a middle-aged man with a friendly demeanor, greeted him warmly. They exchanged pleasantries, but Alexander's mind was elsewhere, scanning every sound, every voice drifting through the hallway. Was she here? Would she walk through that door at any moment? Halfway through their discussion, the door opened, and his breath caught. It wasn't Layla, but the young woman who entered held a file that bore her name. "Here are the revised blueprints, sir," she said, setting the folder on the table. Alexander's eyes locked on the label. Project Lead, Layla Porter. Porter. She had taken her maiden name. The realization hit him harder than he expected, and he barely registered the architect thanking the assistant before she left. His focus narrowed entirely on the folder before him. "Mr. Ford?" The architect's voice pulled him back. "Is something wrong?" Alexander hesitated, then leaned forward. "This project lead, Layla Porter, she seems highly involved. Would it be possible to meet her?" The architect smiled, oblivious to the significance of the request. "Of course. Layla's one of our top designers. She's on site today, but will be back this afternoon. I'll make the introduction." Alexander nodded, his heart pounding. The moment he had waited for, dreamed of, was now within reach. But as the architect continued talking, one question burned in his mind. Would she want to see him, or would she turn him away? Alexander spent the rest of the morning pacing the streets of Paris, unable to sit still as the hours dragged by. His usual composure was gone, replaced by an anxious energy he couldn't control. He walked past street cafes, through cobblestone alleys, and along the banks of the Seine, the city alive with romance and beauty, just as Layla had always described it. Every corner reminded him of her. The way she used to describe Paris as though it were a lover waiting to be embraced. He had never understood her poetic nature back then, brushing it off as fanciful nonsense. Now, he felt like a man who had been blind for too long, finally seeing what had been in front of him all along. By mid-afternoon, Alexander found himself back at the architect's office, his hands gripping the leather arms of the chair as he waited. The meeting room was silent, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Every passing second felt like an eternity. And then he heard it, a familiar voice drifting down the hallway. Her voice. His heart thundered in his chest as the door opened. There she was. Layla Porter stepped into the room, her posture confident yet graceful, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore a tailored blazer and a silk blouse, her style elegant and understated. Her face was unchanged, though her eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before. She had grown into herself, into her strength, and she was more beautiful than he remembered. She froze when her gaze met his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The architect, oblivious to the tension, gestured between them. Layla, this is Mr. Ford. He's a client interested in our Al Rayyan project. I thought it would be good for you two to connect. Her expression shifted, shock, recognition, and something he couldn't quite place. Mr. Ford, she said, her tone carefully neutral. It's been a while. Hearing her address him so formally felt like a punch to the gut. It has, he replied, standing and offering his hand. When their fingers touched, a spark of electricity passed between them, and for a brief moment he saw the flicker of emotion in her eyes before she pulled her hand away. Shall we? The architect asked, gesturing to the table. The three of them sat down, but Alexander's focus was entirely on Layla. Her professionalism was impeccable, her responses measured and precise. She spoke about the project with ease, never once letting her gaze linger on him for too long. It was maddening. When the meeting ended, the architect excused himself, leaving them alone. The silence that followed was deafening. Layla, Alexander began, his voice low and unsure for the first time in years. I didn't come here for business. She crossed her arms, her expression guarded. I figured as much. He swallowed, his words catching in his throat. I heard your voice on that call. I didn't plan this. I didn't even know you were in Paris. But the moment I heard you, I knew I had to come. Her eyes softened for a fleeting second before hardening again. It's been 20 years, Alexander. 20 years since you walked away. I didn't walk away, he said quickly, his voice desperate. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought... You thought your career was more important than us, she interrupted, her tone cutting. And maybe it was. You've clearly done well for yourself. He stepped closer, the vulnerability in his voice breaking through her defenses. I was wrong, Layla. I've spent every day since regretting it. Her lips parted as if to respond, but she hesitated, her emotions warring behind her eyes. Finally, She turned away. You can't just show up here and expect everything to go back to how it was. I don't expect that, he said softly. I just want a chance to talk, to explain. Please. Layla's shoulders tensed, but she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Meet me at Café Lumière tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. As she left the room, Alexander felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He had a chance, just one, and he wasn't going to waste it. Alexander arrived at Café Lumière early the next morning, the Parisian streets still quiet as the city began to wake. The small café was tucked away on a cobblestone street, its charm accentuated by flower boxes on the windows and the scent of freshly baked pastries wafting through the air. He chose a table by the window, his back to the bustling street, and waited. Every passing moment felt heavier, the weight of his decision to come here pressing down on him. He adjusted his tailored blazer, ran a hand through his hair, and took a deep breath. This was his moment, a chance to fix what had been broken for 2 decades. At precisely 8 o'clock, the door chimed, and there she was. Layla entered the café, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, a soft scarf draped around her neck. She wore a fitted coat over a simple blouse, her style effortless yet captivating. As their eyes met, she hesitated for a moment before making her way to his table. "You're early," she said as she sat down, her tone neutral, but her expression betraying a flicker of emotion. "I couldn't risk being late," Alexander replied, his voice steady, despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. A waiter approached, and Layla ordered a coffee, her movements measured and calm. Alexander couldn't help but study her, noticing the little details he had forgotten over the years, the way she tilted her head slightly when thinking, the faint dimple that appeared when she pursed her lips. When the waiter left, silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Layla broke it. "So, what is it you want, Alexander?" Her directness caught him off guard, but he had prepared for this moment. "I want to explain," he said, leaning forward. "I want to tell you what I couldn't say back then." She raised an eyebrow, skepticism flashing in her eyes. "What could you possibly say now that you couldn't say 20 years ago?" "I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought I was doing what was best for us, focusing on my career so we could have a future. But all I did was push you away. I see that now." Layla's expression softened for a moment before she looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "You made your choice, Alexander, and I made mine." "I know," he said quietly. "But hearing your voice again, it made me realize that I've been running from this, from you. I can't change what happened, but I can't ignore how I feel." Her gaze snapped back to his, anger and pain flashing in her eyes. "And how do you feel, Alexander? Because 20 years ago, you didn't seem to feel much at all." "I feel like I lost the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, his voice breaking. "And I don't want to lose you again." The vulnerability in his tone seemed to disarm her. She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's not that simple." "I know it's not," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or for you to pick up where we left off. I want to get to know you again, to show you that I'm not the man I was back then." Layla was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Finally, she spoke. "Why now, Alexander, after all this time?" "Because I finally realized that none of this—" He gestured vaguely, referring to his wealth and success, "means anything without you." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. "It's not that easy to rebuild something that's been broken for so long. I'm not asking for easy, he said, his tone resolute. I'm asking for a chance. Layla studied him, her expression unreadable. The moments stretched endlessly before she finally nodded, almost imperceptibly. All right, she said softly. A chance. Relief flooded through Alexander, but he kept his composure. Thank you, he said earnestly. As the two sat there, sipping coffee and exchanging tentative words, the warmth of the cafe seemed to melt the ice between them. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. The days following their meeting at Café Lumière were cautious, yet filled with a quiet anticipation. Alexander and Layla agreed to take things slowly, to explore the possibility of reconnecting without the weight of 20 years pressing down on every word. For the first time in decades, Alexander felt a spark of hope, fragile but persistent. They met again at the Luxembourg Gardens, a place Layla had mentioned during their marriage as one of her dream destinations. The sprawling park was alive with vibrant blooms and couples strolling hand in hand, the serenity of the surroundings providing the perfect backdrop for their tentative reconnection. Alexander arrived early, as usual, and waited by a fountain where sunlight danced across the water's surface. When Layla appeared, dressed in a light blue dress that swayed in the gentle breeze, his heart skipped a beat. She looked radiant, but there was a guardedness in her expression that reminded him of the careful line they were treading. Luxembourg Gardens, she said with a small smile as she approached. I wasn't sure you'd remember. I remember everything, he replied softly, motioning to a nearby bench. Shall we? They sat side by side, the sounds of the bustling park filling the silence between them. Alexander wanted to say so much, but he knew the risk of overwhelming her. He decided to start small. How long have you been in Paris? He asked, his voice steady but curious. About 6 years, Layla replied, gazing out at the children playing by the fountain. After I finished my degree in architecture, I moved here for work. It was supposed to be temporary, but I fell in love with the city. He nodded, absorbing her words. It suits you. I can see why you'd stay. And you? She asked, turning to him with a raised brow. Still buried in work? Alexander chuckled softly, though the question struck a nerve. I've learned to balance things better, or at least I'm trying to. I spent too many years letting my work define me. Layla tilted her head, studying him. And now? Now I'm realizing there's more to life than success, he admitted. I don't want to lose any more time. Her expression softened slightly, but her walls were still firmly in place. It's good to hear that, Alexander. But words are easy. It's actions that matter. Her statement hung in the air, a challenge that he couldn't ignore. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he gathered his thoughts. You're right, and I don't expect you to believe me overnight. But I'm here, Layla. I'm here because I want to prove it to you. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the fountain. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. I spent years resenting you, blaming you for everything that went wrong. But as time passed, I realized I wasn't entirely innocent. I let myself disappear in our relationship, always accommodating your dreams and forgetting about my own. Alexander's chest tightened. Hearing her speak so candidly about their past brought a lump to his throat. I never wanted you to feel that way, he said earnestly. I was blind to what was happening, and I regret it every single day. Layla's eyes met his, and for the first time since their reunion, her expression softened. Regret won't change the past, Alexander. But maybe Maybe it can shape the future." The words gave him a flicker of hope, and he nodded. "That's all I'm asking for. A chance to shape something better." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the gardens, their conversation shifting between the present and the past. Layla spoke about her work, her travels, and the life she had built for herself. Alexander listened intently, marveling at the strength and independence she had cultivated in his absence. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they found themselves back at the fountain where they had started. Layla turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I'm not saying this will be easy, Alexander, but I'm willing to see where it goes." His heart swelled at her words, and he offered a small, sincere smile. "That's all I could hope for." As they parted ways, Alexander felt lighter than he had in years. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt like he had a real chance to make things right. Alexander stood on the balcony of his hotel suite, the Paris skyline glowing softly under the evening sky. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly fallen rain and the distant hum of the city. He should have felt elated after his day with Layla. She had given him something he never thought he'd have, a second chance. Yet, a quiet unease lingered in his chest. As much as he tried to focus on the future, the weight of their past threatened to pull him under. Their conversation at the Luxembourg Gardens had been honest, but it had also reopened wounds he had spent 2 decades ignoring. The mistakes he'd made, the nights he'd stayed late at the office while she waited for him at home, the arguments that always ended with her walking away and him staying silent, all of it played on a loop in his mind. He knew he had to address the past if he wanted to build a future with her. But how? How could he convince her that he was no longer the man who had let her slip away? The next morning, Alexander arrived at Layla's office unannounced. The receptionist, initially surprised, guided him to a private conference room where Layla was reviewing blueprints with a colleague. When she saw him, her brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Alexander," she said, setting her pen down, "this is unexpected." "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone calm but insistent. He glanced at her colleague. "Alone." Layla sighed but nodded, dismissing the colleague with a wave of her hand. As the door closed behind them, she crossed her arms and faced him. "What is it?" "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said yesterday," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "About how you lost yourself in our relationship. I need you to know that I see it now. I see how much I hurt you, and I hate that I didn't realize it sooner." She looked at him, her expression guarded. "Why now, Alexander? Why after all these years?" "Because hearing your voice, seeing you again, it brought everything back," he said, stepping closer. "I've spent my life building something I thought would make me happy, but it's all meaningless without you." Her arms dropped to her sides, and for a moment her gaze softened. "Do you even know who I am anymore? I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago." "I know," he said quietly. "And I want to get to know the person you've become. I want to understand your life, your dreams, everything I missed while I was too blind to see what mattered." She hesitated, her eyes searching his. "You can't erase the past, Alexander." "I'm not trying to," he replied, "but I believe we can learn from it. I'm here because I don't want to make the same mistake twice." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging between them. Finally, Layla spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You hurt me, Alexander, more than you'll ever know. I've never stopped wondering what might have been if things had been different. His heart swelled with a mixture of hope and regret. Then let me make it different now, he said, his voice earnest. I'll do whatever it takes. Layla stared at him for what felt like an eternity before nodding slowly. This isn't going to be easy. I need time to figure out what I want. You'll have all the time you need, he said. Just don't shut me out. As they left the office together, Alexander felt a cautious optimism bloom within him. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance between rebuilding trust and rediscovering each other. Alexander respected Layla's boundaries, reaching out only when invited and listening more than he spoke. They met for quiet dinners, strolled through Parisian streets, and shared memories of their time together while cautiously creating new ones. Layla began to let her guard down, revealing glimpses of the woman she had become, a fiercely independent and accomplished architect with a life she had built from scratch. Alexander admired her strength, but more importantly, he admired her resilience. One evening, as they walked along the Seine, Layla paused and turned to him. "You've changed, Alexander," she said softly. "I don't know where this will go, but I'm willing to see." Her words were a balm to his soul. He knew the journey wasn't over, but they were finally on the same path. Alexander and Layla's tentative reconnection faced its first real test when a business emergency forced Alexander back to Dubai. The distance tested their fragile bond, with missed calls and misunderstandings threatening to unravel their progress. But Alexander did what he had never done before. He prioritized her. Late-night calls, surprise visits, and heartfelt letters reminded Layla that she was no longer second to his work. It wasn't grand gestures that won her over, but his consistent effort to show that she mattered. When Alexander returned to Paris after resolving the crisis, Layla greeted him with a quiet smile. "Maybe there's hope for us after all," she said, her tone teasing, but warm. Months later, Alexander found himself back in the Luxembourg Gardens, standing by the fountain where their journey had begun anew. This time, Layla was beside him, her hand resting comfortably in his. "Do you regret coming to Paris?" she asked, her voice light but curious. "Not for a second," he replied, his tone firm. "I found something far more important than success. I found you." Layla smiled, leaning into him as the sunlight bathed them in its warmth. It wasn't perfect, and they both knew challenges lay ahead, but they were ready to face them together. This is more than a story about rekindling love. It's a story about second chances, growth, and the courage to fight for what truly matters. If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes in the power of love and redemption. Together, let's spread stories that inspire and remind us all of the beauty in second chances.